I would like to take some time now to look into like in terms of the way this case is being framed. So the trial started today, and last week, the New York Times wrote a big article based on newly released records. Headline: Epstein's final days, celebrity reminiscing and a running toilet. The point of the article is to be that like they looked at the case again, and based on new documents, they can say again that he definitely did kill himself. And, you know, obviously the timing of this is quite obvious. But nonetheless, this is a very interesting article, both for what it does say and what it doesn't say. And I think I know I alluded to it on last week's episode, but there's a lot here that I think is worth going into. So this is a big splashy piece in the New York Times. Newly released records show the disgraced financier living a mundane existence in jail before his suicide, while also spinning deceptions until the very end. The deception here that he is spinning seems to be that he was murdered. Like that he killed himself, but in doing so, he was like it continued to perpetrate this world of deception and illusions that he catered to and was a part of.
He was doing like an epic prank, basically.
Yeah. It says here, the article begins, the disgraced financier, jailed in Manhattan on federal sex trafficking charges involving teenage girls, was found unconscious on the floor of his cell one morning in July 2019, a strip of bedsheet tied around his bruised neck. In the hours and days that followed the suicide attempt, Jeffrey Epstein would claim to be living a wonderful life, denying any thoughts of ending it, even as he sat on suicide watch and faced daunting legal troubles. I have no interest in killing myself, Mr. Epstein told a jailhouse psychologist, according to Bureau of Prisons documents that have not been previously made public. He was, a quote, a coward and did not like pain, he explained. I would not do that to myself. But 2 weeks later, he did just that. He died in his cell on August 10th in the Metropolitan Correction Center, having hanged himself with a bedsheet, the medical examiner ruled. After a life of manipulation, Mr. Epstein created illusions until the very end, deceiving correctional officers, counselors, and specifically trained inmates assigned to monitor him around the clock, according to the documents, among more than 2,000 pages of Federal Bureau of Prisons records obtained by the New York Times after filing a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit. The detailed notes and reports compiled by those who interacted with Mr. Epstein during his 36 days of detention show how he repeatedly assured them he had much to live for, while also hinting that he was increasingly despondent. The clues prompted too little action by jail and bureau officials who made mistake after mistake leading up to Mr. Epstein's death, the records reveal. He says he passed many days closed in a conference room with his lawyers, avoiding the confines of his dank and dirty cell. In conversations with psychologists and other inmates, he spoke of his interest in physics and mathematics and offered tidbits of investment advice. He reminisced about socializing with celebrities, even as he complained about the running toilet in his cell, the orange prison garb, his difficulty sleeping, his dehydration, and a numbness in his right arm. I just like he, even in prison, he's still trying to recruit people for the various scams and it's like various like money shenanigans that he was up to, and doing it by being like, oh, you should definitely consider investing with me. I know Kevin Spacey. I've hung out with him.
Prison has to be like, I mean, no one wants to go to prison, but for like a middle-aged Jewish guy, it's kind of like, you know, it's said that like Biden actually loves it when bad things happen to him because he's Catholic. Like that's the Catholic thing. I think for a Jewish guy, like a jail, like there's a lot to complain about.
You can complain nonstop. You can natter at people and they can't go anywhere.
Yeah. My bed's small.
The food is terrible in such small portions.
There's a breeze. And you'd be right. There would be. That's why I really don't believe that. When I'm elected as senator from New York and do finally hold these hearings, I'll be like, he wouldn't have killed himself because a Jewish guy that age would love jail. There's so much he could have whined about.
I mean,
it's okay. I'm that age now. I'm 60 when I get elected.
Going on here, it says, the newly obtained records offer no support to the explosion of conspiracy theories that Mr. Epstein's death was not a suicide. They also shed no light on questions raised by his brother and one of his lawyers that he might have been assisted in killing himself. But they do paint a picture of incompetence and sloppiness by some within the Bureau of Prisons, which runs the Federal Detention Center. An intake screening form erroneously described Mr. Epstein as a black male, and then in parentheses, he was white, and indicated that he had... and indicated that he had no prior sex offense convictions, even though he was a registered sex offender with 2008 convictions in Florida for solicitation of prostitution, and procurement of minors to engage in prostitution. A few social phone calls were not recorded, logged, or monitored. Records show an apparent violation of jail policy. So I mean, just that paragraph alone, right there, is very telling. And I understand the people that are writing this, like they set it up to be like, there's been no evidence that he killed himself, but what there is evidence of is a ton of bungles on behalf of the Bureau of Prisons. And I just gotta say, I mean, one of these things would be pretty ridiculous. I mean, entering him into the system as a black man is pretty fucking funny. It's almost like they were sort of trying to lose track of him. And then logging him into prison as someone without any prior sex offenses, also a bit strange. And then the fact that his phone calls were not being recorded or monitored on a number of occasions, I gotta say, one of these bungles, okay, understandable. Two, okay, that's something smells funny. But like all three of those, like I said, the details in this story, I think, are telling in a way. It's like that was someone who wrote this article like trying to make the opposite case, because like I think that there's a number of these telling details in here, like the fact that he kept telling his psychologist, "quote I have no interest in killing myself," over and over again.
Yeah, the phone calls one is the one that sticks out the most to me, because it's like, I don't know, whether the individuals that wrote this article, whether they had to write it that way or whether, they're along for the ride. But like, oh yeah, just another oversight that they didn't record this specific guy's phone calls amidst everything else. I mean, it does make me think of, people kind of discarded this one. People aren't as into this one anymore, but it was pretty big a couple of years ago. The theory that he didn't act like he's not dead.
Yeah.
It does make you think of that one. That one's pretty interesting.
It says here, the night he killed himself, Mr. Epstein lied to jail officials and said he wanted to phone his mother, who was long dead. He instead called his girlfriend. Jail personnel left him alone in his cell that night, despite an explicit directive that he be assigned a cellmate. I mean, like I read this whole article now, and they just set up bungle after bungle on behalf of the Bureau of Prisons. But like, there's no effort in this article to like, I don't know, drill down on any of the people who made these fucking errors. Like the fact that the most high profile inmate in federal custody could just tell his jailers, "I'd like to call my mom," and have them not be aware that his mom is dead. Like I said, I mean, I could see that happening for someone who was just booked for like drunk driving or something like that, but not a case like this.
I mean, the only way it works is if you're basically saying, you don't understand. Nobody's calls are getting recorded. Nobody's information is being recorded correctly. This is literally a bunch of submental dipshits just banging into each other and getting paid to do so. And but the thing is, if that's the case, then why the hell should any argument be credited that says that somebody couldn't have gone in there and fucking killed the guy?
Yeah.
And also, I mean, the recorded calls thing, we know for a fact that's not true because people in New York, like, they've had things from their jail phone calls rolled into their RICOs in a lot of gang cases. So we know that's not fucking true. Like, in the past few years, in the same time frame. But yeah, as Matt said, yeah, it sounds like, wow, I mean, yeah, it sounds like you're running a loose ship where fucking Les Wexner could kill anyone in there for what, like $50,000?
Yeah. Yeah, you're making an argument that is such a poorly supervised and underfunded thing, which I believe that I can't believe anything you say about who was allowed near the fucking cell, how closely it was supervised. I can't have any faith that anybody with a little bit of money and motivation couldn't just do whatever they wanted in there.
Yeah, exactly. Like, exactly. This entire article is like, oh yeah, and for 3 weeks he was in a blanket fort, and we couldn't find him. And then another week he told us all to close our eyes and just walked around and like left and came back. But like, if someone came in here, we'd know. No,
I mean, so sorry, just read this once again. It said, the night he killed himself, Mr. Epstein lied to jail officials and said he wanted to phone his mother. So he's in his cell, and then he's just like, guard, I'd like to call my mom. I'd like to talk to my mommy right now. Like, does anything you know about how you're treated in prison or even just awaiting trial in this country jibe with the idea that he was like all the fucking that he was just allowed to just be like, hey, can I call my mom? I'd like my own cell, please. And they're just like, yeah, okay, sure. I mean, they might as well be saying, in addition to these bungles, on several nights during his stay in the MCC, during night, all the doors became unlocked for several hours. It says here, 2 days after the suicide, William P. Barr, then the U.S. Attorney General, said that there were serious irregularities at the correctional center, but did not elaborate. He later blamed a perfect storm of screw-ups.
I hate those perfect storms of screw-ups.
A 15-page psychological reconstruction of Mr. Epstein's death, compiled by Bureau officials 5 weeks later and never before made public, concluded that his identity, quote, appeared to be based on his wealth, power, and association with other high-profile individuals. The lack of significant interpersonal connections, a complete loss of his status in both the community and among associates, and the idea of potentially spending his life in prison, the postmortem continued, were likely factors contributing to Mr. Epstein's suicide. Well, I mean, for that bulletproof fucking bit of mind hunting right there, is a profile that one could write of virtually anyone incarcerated.
Yeah. It's like, hey, their self-worth was defined by not being in jail. All the things that made life worth living for them involved not being in a small cell with other guys.
Being able to leave a room when they wanted to.
The Inspector General's report recommends that all inmates read Adbusters. You are not your fucking table.
He seemed happy and in good spirits until he was facing 20 years to life in federal prison. I think it was like one of the factors that contributed to this state of despondence was going from a very, very high level of comfort and luxury to a comparatively very, very low level of comfort and luxury. And in fact, one might say none at all in the most squalid conditions imaginable. Going on here, it says, the Times obtained the materials after suing the Bureau of Prisons, which had repeatedly rejected its public records requests. As part of a settlement, the agency agreed to turn over internal memos and emails, visitor logs, handwritten notes from inmates, and the psychological reconstruction of Mr. Epstein's death. Many of the documents were heavily redacted. Some were withheld entirely, including a number of records associated with the earlier suicide attempt. All right, so we have a very full picture here of his mental health in the days and hours leading up to his suicide. Going on here, it says, talking about celebs. This is a subhead. Mr. Epstein's stay at the detention center began on Saturday, July 6, 2019, after his arrest at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, where he had arrived from Paris on a private jet. Going on, it says, he initially was placed in the general inmate population, the jail's least restrictive area. In an internal email, okay, keep in mind here, it says, okay, so he was arrested, one of the most high-profile cases in U.S. history. He's arrested at Teterboro Airport on his plane after coming back from Paris. So significant flight risk. He's arrested. We know from earlier in the article, he's then logged into prison as a black man with no sex offenses on his record, and then is immediately put in general population, quote, the least restrictive part of the prison. Do the earlier fuck-ups in this perfect storm of bungles begin to, take on a different light here? I don't know. Just asking questions. It says here, in an internal email, Hugh Hurwitz, then the Bureau of Prisons acting director, later attributed this to an oversight by the U.S. Marshal Service. Raylan, what did I tell you? Raylan, it's just, he saw a sexy lady before you logged him in, and then he tipped his hat and said, ma'am.
I hate to admit it, but yeah, Raylan Givens would completely fuck this case up. Oh my God. He would fuck Ghislaine before the case, completely honey trapped, not even realizing it. He would lose Epstein 40 times. He would make it so it's really weird. I have to have an Old West shootout at an abandoned public school in upstate New York against Les Wexner's goons. The last thing I wanted to do.
It says, apparently the U.S. Marshal Service did not indicate that he was a high-profile inmate, and staff were unaware that he was coming, so no plans had been established, he wrote. Look, I will accept a lot. You can this is the brilliance of this, because you can get a really long way with the argument that every single institution that like governs American life is run by absolute fucking numbskulls who have no idea what they're doing.
Yeah, I buy it.
Yeah.
The plausible.
I get it. But like the fucking the FBI or the U.S. Marshal Service, if they were booking someone into jail on like a minor drug trafficking charge, they would have this shit sewn the fuck up. I mean, it's just like the incompetence things only goes so far when you see so many other people getting fucking nailed to the wall with every possible millimeter covered of just squashing out their life and throwing them into the carceral system that like, I just don't buy this idea that the U.S. Marshals are just like, yeah, sorry, we forgot to tell anyone he was coming. And then logged him in as a black guy. It says, that evening, according to the post-mortem reconstruction, a facilities assistant found Mr. Epstein in his cell looking distraught, sad, and a little confused, she said in an email to 3 jail officials. When the assistant asked if he was okay, he said he was, but she was not convinced, she wrote. He seemed dazed and withdrawn. She added, just to be on the safe side and prevent any suicidal thoughts, can someone from psychology come and talk with him? No one did at first, according to records. Okay, so let's just go back here. So the U.S. Marshals forgot to tell anyone he was a high-profile inmate. He was booked into prison basically as a completely different individual in general population. And then from the minute he was in jail, we have a paper trail being created of people writing in official emails. He looks sad. He looks withdrawn. He looks like he's sort of lost the will to live. Better check up on that and send a psychologist to, further backstop this alibi here. You know what I mean? Like, it's just sort of like a narrative is already being constructed. And this is what I find interesting about this article here.
Yeah, they let him watch the ending of Game of Thrones. So he would feel all sad and vaguely confused. Very devilish.
On Sunday, July 7th, the center's warden, Lamine Nadeh, properly identified Mr. Epstein as high profile and had him moved to the special housing unit, or SHU, on the 9th floor, out of concerns for his personal safety and general population, according to Mr. Hurwitz's email. But it was not until 9:30 a.m. that Monday that Mr. Epstein was taken for an initial psychological evaluation, as had been suggested when he arrived. That afternoon, Mr. Epstein was set to make his first court appearance. Anticipating that he would be denied bail, the jail's chief psychologist recommended that he be evaluated for suicide risk upon his return, given the media attention and nature of the charges. I mean, like, do you know how many people kill themselves in Rikers Island every year? Is the teenager who has been in Rikers for 5 years for hopping a turnstile that everyone forgot about? I mean, are like when they're booked, do they go, God, he looks sad? Do you think the fact that he's being lost in this Kafkaesque nightmare with like no hope for the future or ever getting out or even knowing what he's charged with would lead him to kill himself? I don't know. Let's book him some time with a psychologist. It's just, like you said, at the same time, it's like everyone is perfectly incompetent, but there's this like boutique psychological treatment for every fucking, every inmate that's awaiting like or serious charges or may be denied bail. I mean, like, again, you can believe everyone's incompetent, but like what we know about the U.S. prison system is that it is like comprehensively hell on earth for everyone involved in it. And then there's just all these emails being like, he looks sad. Can we cheer him up? Is there anything we can do for the guy? He just looks so down.
Yeah, they had NBA YoungBoy, who's a pretty popular rapper. They had him in federal lockup in Utah from March until like last month. I do not remember anything like this about him. And his charge was way less serious. No one seemed to lose track of him either, interestingly.
Yeah. Inmate Epstein will likely be receiving bad news in court today and has multiple risk factors for suicidality as identified by BOP statistics, the psychologist wrote. Let's be proactive. I mean, I'm sorry, like Federal Bureau of Prisons officials, I do not believe that they are proactive in like sort of buttressing the mental health of people trapped in their gulags.
Most of their prisons are designed to make people want to kill themselves.
So it goes, Mr. Epstein spent his nights pacing his cell, sleeping fitfully, and talking with other inmates, according to handwritten notes taken by those observing him. Often the entries were mundane. Epstein is drinking water at the sink, but some were more evocative, suggesting at once his grim predicament and his unrealistic expectations. Epstein is sitting on the edge of the bed with his head in the palm of his hands, one inmate wrote on July 29th. I mean, I would imagine that would be like a common position for you if you're in a jail cell awaiting fucking trial for sex trafficking or anything. It's just like, wow, this confluence of details just seems to add up that he was really not happy being in jail. In conversations with his minders, Mr. Epstein seemed to stick to subjects that would convey the impression he was approachable, yet well-connected and successful. Epstein and I are talking about the escort business, an inmate wrote 8 o'clock one evening. An hour later, Epstein and I are talking about arbitrage. 30 minutes more, Epstein is talking about celebs he knows. The notes do not name any of the celebrities.
Wow.
Those are all the redacted documents that the New York Times couldn't get access to.
Did they have Vicky Ward in there in a DUI? What the fuck?
In another entry, an inmate noted that he and Mr. Epstein had talked about driving taxis in New York. We both drove, the inmate pointed out. Throughout it all, Mr. Epstein remained curious about his surroundings. On one of the first evenings, he asked an inmate whose name was redacted from the records about the kinds of crazy things he had seen in jail. Close to midnight, an inmate reported Mr. Epstein was offered dinner, but refused it because it was nasty. He is right. The next subhead for this New York Times article is the quote, "Being alive is fun."
Well, what's up, man?
Okay. On the morning of Tuesday, July 9th, Mr. Epstein underwent the requested formal in-person suicide risk evaluation. The psychologist whose name is redacted from the documents, it's actually Jolly West, probably. The psychologist whose name was redacted from the documents found Mr. Epstein to be polite, cooperative, organized, coherent, and even showing a sense of humor. Epstein adamantly denied any suicidal ideation, intention, or plan, she wrote in her notes. He requested a phone call, a meeting with his lawyer, a shower, and to brush his teeth. Mr. Epstein described himself to her as a banker with big business and said that being alive is fun. He denied having sexually abused anyone and said he would have a renewed bail hearing the next week, where he believed he would be released. He was future-oriented, the psychologist wrote. She concluded that suicide watch was not warranted, but that out of an abundance of caution, Mr. Epstein should remain on psychological observation. The next day, Mr. Epstein asked to be single-celled, but was told he could not be housed alone for safety and security concerns. And the day after that, a psychologist wrote, he was smirking and said, "Why would you ever think I would be suicidal? I'm not suicidal, and I would never be." Once again, we have this thing where, like, prison psychologists and the prison itself are noting in the official record in their log entries over and over again that he seems sad, despondent, but but also like unrealistic expectations about like his future. And then Epstein, knowing who he is and what he probably knew, made very sure to say to his jailers and his psychologists over and over again that I'm not suicidal and I love being alive.
Life fucking rocks, dude. It's my favorite. Never kill myself.
I love life. My life a movie.
My life an illegal movie.
The logs are, let's go serious. The logs are also revealing for what they lack. Any sign of visits by the famous and wealthy friends he socialized with after his 2008 sex offense convictions in Florida. Instead, the logs show a far more mundane cast of visitors, including a parade of lawyers. On July 18th, it became apparent that Mr. Epstein was unlikely to return to his former life and friends anytime soon, if ever, when Judge Richard M. Berman denied a renewed bail request. 5 days later, in the early morning hours of July 23rd, Mr. Epstein made his suicide attempt. The denial of bail was cited as a significant disappointment for Mr. Epstein and likely challenged his ability and willingness to adapt to incarceration, according to the post-mortem psychological reconstruction. Given the potential impact of the judge's decision, a psychologist should have assessed Mr. Epstein's mental status upon his return to the institution, it said. He was removed from suicide watch after about 31 hours, according to the documents, and again placed on psychological observation.
Did they talk about that psycho?
Yeah, when did that guy try to kill him? Yeah.
Yeah, that's the suicide attempt they're talking about.
Yeah.
That guy.
Yeah. No, that's what I was saying. Like, and it's very unclear in this article. They're like the first suicide attempt that didn't work, and then he was like not placed on suicide watch after that. I think they're referring to that roided out Long Island cop that murdered all those people for the cartel and fucking tried to kill him.
Yes. No, that's exactly the thing they're talking about.
It was not a suicide attempt.
The evil Mr. Clean.
Yeah. We talked about that guy in our very first episode with Truanon.
Yeah, the guy who
Tattaglione.
Yeah, who
he was a dude who was burying people in his front yard in Westchester.
And like again, like they don't like. There's not a lot of details about this first suicide attempt, other than that he was taken off suicide watch.
Yeah.
He goes, in conversations with people from psychological services over the next week, Mr. Epstein repeatedly denied having suicidal thoughts. He smiled and cracked jokes. He told them he was Jewish and suicide was against his religion. Felix's theory is being further buttressed by the documents here.
I will be the new Frank Church. I will be the senator from New York.
He also reiterated complaints about the running toilet in his cell, which left him feeling agitated for hours. He said he sat in the corner and held his ears, a psychologist wrote. Mr. Epstein speculated that he might have autism, noting that Dustin Hoffman's autistic character in Rain Man had an aversion to noise. Gotta call Wexner. Gotta call Wexner. Got a 330 Wexner.
That's when the inmate notes get more specific. Yeah, he talked to me about Beyblade for 6 hours. Knew the name of every Bionicle.
Some within the justice system voiced concerns about his mental state. Federal marshals who had escorted him to a July 31st court hearing returned with a prisoner custody alert notice, which said Mr. Epstein might have suicidal tendencies. It turns out he was just wearing a T-shirt of his favorite band, Suicidal Tendencies.
All I want is a Pepsi, and shit wouldn't give it to me.
This prompted another suicide risk assessment by a psychologist. Mr. Epstein again denied having suicidal thoughts. The psychologist was persuaded, according to the documents, writing that a suicide watch was not warranted. He stated he lives for and plans to finish this case and go back to his normal life, the psychologist wrote. Among the documents obtained by the Times was an undated sign on an orange paper that read, "Mandatory rounds must be conducted every 30 minutes on Epstein, prisoner number 76318-054, as per God, G-O-D." The word mandatory was misspelled and underlined in pen, and the question mark was written after it. The records offered no explanation of the sign, and bureau officials declined to answer questions about it. Epstein, as per God. Exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. Mandatory misspelled. This is like the Lionel Hutz card. No, money down. Okay, so I guess the last day. When he arrived back in the SHU on July 30th, Mr. Epstein was given a cellmate, Ephraim Reyes, a prisoner who was assisting the government in a drug distribution conspiracy case. Mr. Epstein complained that the man's talking kept him awake at night. That all changed on August 9th when Mr. Reyes was transferred out of the jail and the staff was alerted that Mr. Epstein would need a new cellmate. We know what's coming. I mean, he got a new cellmate, that's for sure.
Yeah.
The same day, the day before Mr. Epstein died, as he huddled with his lawyers in a conference room, a federal appeals court unsealed about 2,000 pages of previously confidential documents in a defamation lawsuit against Ghislaine Maxwell, his longtime associate and former girlfriend. Ms. Maxwell, who was charged last year with sex trafficking and other offenses, faces trial this month in Manhattan. The materials revealed highly disturbing details at Mr. Epstein's alleged sex trafficking ring, including graphic depositions, police reports, and an Amazon receipt for books like Training with Ms. Abernathy, a workbook for erotic slaves and their owners. Officials later surmised in the psychological reconstruction that the document release worsened his mental state, further eroding his previously enjoyed elevated status and potentially implicating some of his associates. I mean, I don't buy this. He's been booked for sex trafficking charges in prison. I don't think his status could erode any further at that point. However, the note about implicating potential some of his associates is interesting to me. That evening, according to the reconstruction, a unit manager at the detention center helped Mr. Epstein make a social phone call. Again, like, are you allowed to make I guess you are allowed phone time in prison, but like, I don't know. This just seems like he's just asking people, hey, can I make a phone call? And they're like, sure. It's like it's fucking like camp or something. I don't know. The manager dialed Mr. Epstein and let him speak for 15 minutes. The call was not properly logged and does not appear to have been recorded. It is not clear from the documents whether the call was on a monitored line. I asked inmate Epstein who he was calling, the unit manager wrote. He stated his mother. Mr. Epstein's mother died in 2004. The call was his 30-year-old girlfriend, whom he had helped put through dental school. This said 3 people with knowledge of the phone conversation. I mean, if this call wasn't logged or monitored, how would any 3 people have knowledge of the conversation? And who are these people? Interesting question.
Who are these people?
Mr. Epstein, they said, gave no indication during the call that he planned to kill himself. The call that night, however, was not included in the phone logs provided to the Times by the Bureau of Prisons. The logs show only one social call during his stay more than a week earlier to Miss Shuliak, his girlfriend. After finishing the call, Mr. Epstein returned to his cell where he was alone because no new cellmate had yet been assigned. He was also left unmonitored by 2 officers on duty, whom prosecutors later accused of spending their time surfing the internet and appearing to be asleep. A psychological profile later revealed that the guards were sleeping in a hammock with a single feather being perpetually pushed up and down as they went woo, 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 woo. This May, the 2 officers entered into a deferred prosecution agreement on charges they had falsified jail records about checking on Mr. Epstein. At 6:30 the next morning, he was found with a bedsheet tied around his neck like a noose. He was pronounced dead an hour later. About 2 months after Mr. Epstein's death, an inmate who appears to have worked in the kitchen emailed the psychology department about a conversation he had with a man whose cell had been next to Mr. Epstein's. He said the other inmate had told him, "Jeffrey Epstein definitely killed himself. Any conspiracy theories to the contrary are ridiculous. The man had heard Mr. Epstein tearing up his sheet before committing suicide," the kitchen worker wrote. "He wanted to kill himself and seized the opportunity when it was available," he added. "Such is life or death in this case." That's the end of the article. The end of the article is a detail about how a guy who worked in the kitchen emailed the psychology department about a conversation he had with a man whose cell had been next to Epstein's. And that man's opinion, or that man's just stating for the record that Epstein, quote, definitely killed himself. And the evidence for this is that the guy he talked to who had been in the cell next to Epstein heard him tearing up sheets before committing suicide. Well, I mean, he could have heard someone tearing up the sheets. But I mean...
No, he heard him. He was saying, I'm Jeffrey Epstein, and I love tearing sheets before I kill myself. It's my favorite thing to do. I used to love being alive, but this is actually even better.
Being dead.
Being dead is awesome.
Being dead is the new being alive. It rules. I mean, again, like, it's so weird that the New York Times published this article, like, the week before Ghislaine's case, and on the anniversary of the Kennedy assassination too. Mm. Very funny. But like, I can't help but think that this article is written to give you the unmistakable conclusion that Epstein absolutely was murdered in prison, because the constellation of details in this article that are supposedly exonerating or case closed on any conspiracy theory are so fucking strange. And then the conclusion in the last paragraph of this like jailhouse informant, 2 degrees of separation away from Jeffrey Epstein, is the final word on the fact that he definitely killed himself, is so fucking odd. It's either they're not trying at all and they don't care because they don't have to try, or they're trying to send coded messages to true seers and investigators in this case. Because, again, like, the constellation of details here is so odd about how he kept telling people on the record that he didn't want to kill himself. And look, I mean, like, you may say that and then may end up killing yourself because, like, you're in jail and facing life behind bars. Okay, fair enough. But then the fact that jail officials, even after his first suicide attempt, kept taking him on and off suicide watch, and then kept creating this weird paper trail where they were like, yeah, this guy definitely might kill himself. Better follow up on that. And then didn't follow up on it ever, but had emails just saying, it's sort of likely this guy's going to kill himself, right? We should probably, take proactive
Even though he keeps saying he doesn't want to, even though he's pretty adamant in the words that he says that he doesn't want to do it.
Very strange, but I would say very fascinating news article here by the New York Times. And just like, okay, the fact that they're like, oh, this is based on all these new documents that we got. By the way, many of those documents were heavily redacted and not released to us.
Yeah.
And also, there's no explanation for like why all of these phones, like the last phone call he made before he died was not logged or monitored by anyone. But sources assure them it was to his girlfriend. Well, I mean, you know what I make of all this. I mean, it's how you could read this article and come away thinking that he wasn't murdered is astonishing to me.
I'm sorry, but the guy who was in the kitchen and heard from the other guy who was next to him said that he did, which is evidence that if you were to use it to claim a conspiracy would absolutely be accepted by the New York Times.
In the Bloomberg Opinion article, they talked to El Chapo's lawyer, who, as a high-profile inmate, facing a high-profile trial, went through a similar process. I would just like to compare the details of their incarceration. What do you think the chances are that any of El Chapo's calls to his mother, girlfriend, friends, associates, social calls were not monitored and logged by the Bureau of Prisons? I mean, if that's the case, I'd love to know about it. Another spectacular bungle on their part. What are the chances that El Chapo could have killed himself in that jail cell? Or that the guards were told to check up on him every half an hour to make sure he doesn't hang himself, were just sleeping all night or surfing the internet? What are the chances that if he did kill himself or died under mysterious circumstances, they could talk to like a guy who talked to a guy who was just like, yeah, don't worry about it. What about, again, like I go back again, what about like what you know firsthand of, or what you simply read about or know through like just your gut feeling about what it's like to be incarcerated, what it's like to be in jail awaiting trial in this country at like Rikers or the MCC or any of these facilities where you're like held, denied bail, awaiting trial. Like, does the portrayal of his treatment by the Bureau of Prisons line up with just what your gut feeling or what you've read about what it's like to be incarcerated in this country is? Does it line up, would you say? And again, does El Chapo's being held in custody in a very similar facility, who made it to every fucking minute of his trial and is now, I think, in what, ADX Florence or something, and now in Supermax? Like, how come none of the guys in Supermax have been able to kill themselves yet? The Unabomber, like any of these guys, like, you think they might want to kill themselves after being like in a closet 23 hours a day for the rest of their lives, but for some reason that's impossible for them to do. Oh, right, because it's like, these facilities are designed to make sure that you can never end your suffering, while at the same time making you want to kill yourself every second of the day that you're awake. Doesn't add up. I mean, like, doesn't add up.
Right. No. Well, I do really like, my favorite like interpretation of this whole affair is when people take like the Elizabeth Warren approach to it, where they're like, there are some structural issues with prisons. And it's like, well, yeah, no shit. But like, I don't think that's all of the thing here. I think you're kind of missing the forest for the trees.
I mean, like,
it's like mostly out of public conversation. So they got what they wanted.
Yeah, like I said, if you were just, if you were sent to Rikers because of like, some fucking some misdemeanor that was never fucking adjudicated, or some petty crime or something like that, and they just like lose you in the system. Like, there are dozens of examples of like teenagers being sent to Rikers Island and then just forgotten about, like not even charged with a felony, who have been there for years in like the most nightmarish conditions imaginable for a person. And then when you make, like, when you set up this idea that like, everyone is just so fucking bad at their jobs that like anything can happen. Like, okay, true, that happens every day. We see that all the fucking time. But like, there are so many examples of like the government or these same institutions being 1000% on point when they want to be. It's just a question of like, when do they get to be incompetent and just like, the Keystone Cops, and when do they get to be like the most powerful government in the world? And I think the disparity between when and who this happens to is quite telling.